The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Sheila Simon, attorney and progressive Democrat, former lieutenant governor of Illinois from 2011 to 2015, and currently running for state senate. Sheila Simon, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, Jim, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back with you and your listeners.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate your time. Now, a recent article in the New York Times exposed the role of money in running your state of Illinois.
Yeah.
In brief, it says a small group of wealthy businessmen got Republican Governor Bruce Rauner elected, and they're basically running the state on behalf of big business. Is that true? Is that accurate?
It is frighteningly accurate. And I think one of the most important parts of the article was an assertion or a sense from this group of very wealthy folks who were not only from Illinois but from around the country, felt that they were not adequately represented in government. And so they decided to jump in. And, you know, I'm appreciative of everyone jumping into the democratic process. I think it works best when we're all working at it. But to for a moment think that the very wealthy are underrepresented does not square with my experience in politics.
Well, you know, you're running for state senate, and of course, you've held the second most powerful office in the state. What can you do about this besides just waiting for that next election? I mean, what are things that you can do now to perhaps correct some of these wrongs, if you will?
Yeah, I think actually there's plenty of room to be working as a member, particularly as a member of the Democratic majority in the state Senate. The state Senate has a big Democratic majority, a supermajority, enough to override a veto when necessary. And I think that that until the end of Governor Rauner's term, we'll probably be assessing everything in terms of, is this something that we can override a veto on? So oddly, in that atmosphere of requiring a supermajority, every vote in each of the House and Senate becomes really important. So I want to make sure that Southern Illinois, which is my part of the state where I live and have for a long, long time, is well represented in those discussions.
Now, Governor Rauner is, everywhere you read, very, very unpopular. Is this more proof that money speaks louder than people?
Well, you know, to some extent, yes and no. Elections are always about choices. Our last governor, Governor Quinn, who I served with as lieutenant governor, was not the most popular of people when he ran for re-election. And I think there was some sense of dissatisfaction even among Democrats in a rush to say, well, let's just elect someone else, and without stopping to think about what the someone else would be. It turns out this someone else, Bruce Rauner, is incredibly anti-union. In fact, we have no budget in the state of Illinois. The Constitution requires that the legislature pass a budget by the end of the legislative session at the end of May. They did. He signed only the part of it that dealt with K through 12 schools and vetoed everything else in the budget. Every other funding for for mental health treatment, every other funding for whatever was in the middle of being built along the, up and down Illinois, vetoed it all, and it's just been horrible. It's been a horrible way to govern a state.
This sounds, well, especially when you talk about people are just feeling, okay, we want something different after Governor Quinn. We need something different. This sounds a lot like what we're seeing on the national level right now.
Doesn't it? It so much is the looking at, and Donald Trump in particular, who I have to say proves that I'm not a great political prognosticator. I thought after the first debate, well, that's the end of Donald Trump, and no, that was not. And I think it's that same kind of attitude. There's a level of anger among voters, and in many ways that's appropriate. It's appropriate to be angry when we have problems that we do, but it's not enough. It's not enough to say I'm angry, so I'm going to go do something crazy. I think the appropriate response is I'm angry, and here's how I'm going to do my part in making things better. Here's what I'm paying attention to in terms of who I'm going to be voting for, not just anyone who fits the blank of being other, but someone who's really going to do the job.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Sheila Simon, former lieutenant governor of Illinois and currently running for state senate in Illinois. Sheila, it really sounds like Governor Rauner is just somewhat of a puppet. And so who are these big money men, and why are so many from out of state?
It's interesting, and I don't know whether the big money convergence just decided to pick Illinois and Bruce Rauner because he was willing to run, or whether Illinois is really the top priority for all these very moneyed people. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that it's sure having an impact. Governor Rauner's anti-union stance is what's really held up us from having a budget. And of course, it really doesn't have much to do with our state budget. So it's a very interesting issue to pick in an interesting way to try and make it work. We have a strong Democratic majority in our House and Senate, and I think a strong majority of people in the state who understand the importance of union rights, of their abilities to organize, and how that helps families all across the state, and rightfully, we're not going to be giving up those rights, even to get a budget that we very much need. So it's interesting to see that this group of wealthy folks has determined that their need to be able to pay workers less is more important than the state's need for a budget.
And it's interesting we see that same sort of attitude. Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin. I mean, it's happening in two states that you would think unions would never go away. Unions were kind of born and grown in these couple of states, and here they are just being eviscerated.
And it's very sad to see what's going on in Wisconsin. I think in some ways that's been a model for Governor Rauner. The difference is in Wisconsin there was, Republican majorities in their House and Senate, so with a very conservative governor, they could enact some of their ideas. Here, thank goodness, we have Democrats protecting our rights in the House and Senate, and unfortunately, because Governor Rauner has insisted on this anti-union drive, it's resulted in a standstill.
Do you get the feeling that what has happened and is happening in Illinois, is it a Republican blueprint for the rest of the nation? Are the billionaires making policy behind the scenes and using those part-time legislators basically to pass the bills that they write?
It could be. If that's the case, I'm really concerned. But certainly there are things that go on that make us look up to Wisconsin and say, wow, yep, that's exactly what they did up there. And it makes us appropriately more passionate about standing up for particularly our right to organize as union members. The way I see it and the way I think most of Illinois sees it, unions help to make our state strong. We're an attractive state because we have a well-educated workforce, and part of that educated workforce is folks who have really good training through their unions, training on how to be safe in doing incredibly unsafe jobs. Just a whole package of benefits that not only do individual workers get from union membership, but our whole state does. We value that here, and so we're hanging on tight.
So are these efforts by the governor, Rauner, and Walker for that matter, is it less about ideology, more about just killing the unions and reducing the government's role in easing the effects of income inequality?
I think you're absolutely right about that. I think it is not so much ideological as profit driven. That they seem to have a firm belief that if big business can make more of a profit, off of us small workers, then Illinois is going to somehow blossom. I think really the opposite has been the reality, is that as we've had this budget standstill, folks have seen Illinois as a less secure place to start or expand a business, and have been not coming to Illinois, or in fact, in some cases, leaving Illinois.
The greed of a few hurting many.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not a new story, but it sure hurts just the same.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, now, before we let you go, we have to have you answer this question. We'll see if we can get you to answer this question. Who are you supporting for president?
I am supporting the Democrat who wins the primaries, and very happily, no matter who it will be. How's that?
That was the answer I kind of expected, which was not a bad answer at all. I will say that as well. Sheila Simon, attorney, Progressive Democrat, former lieutenant governor of the state of Illinois, currently running for state senate. Sheila, thank you so much for your time with us today. We do look forward to having you back again soon.
That sounds great to me. Great talking with you.
You as well. And this is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Hunters have come up with euphemisms to make what they do sound, well, less unpleasant. For example, animals aren't killed, they're harvested. Corporate America is now adopting this verbal ploy, for CEOs urgently need to soften the image of their constant hunt for ways to kill jobs. Their urgency is that they're now pushing a huge new surge in cuts, this time targeting college-educated, white-collar professionals. Their weapon is the same sort of neutron bomb they've used to dispatch millions of blue-collar workers, robots. But robot is a negative term, so it's been replaced with a nondescript acronym, RPAs, Robotic Process Automation. These sophisticated automatons are armed with artificial intelligence, enabling them to take over cognitive work that had been the niche of such highly paid humans as financial analysts, lawyers, engineers, managers, doctors. More than just an incremental extension of a long, slow automation process, this is a big bang. It's presently ripping through the workforce at warp speed, and most of America's vulnerable employees have no idea of what's coming. In a survey of corporate executives last year, nearly 80% of them had already put some forms of RPA in place, with an additional 16% planning to do so within 3 years. McKinsey, the world's biggest corporate strategy consultant, calculates that these thinking robots will displace 45 million U.S. workers in this decade. This is Jim Hightower saying, returning to the hunting analogy, professional jobs requiring human-level judgment have been presumed to be beyond the range of robotic firepower. But as one labor economist now notes, with the mass deployment of RPA technology, that type of work is much more in the kill path. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by our new Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. With kick-ass political spark plugs like Beto O'Rourke, musical champions like Marcia Ball, and grassroots change makers like the New Georgia Project and People's Action, The Lowdown Happy Hour is reaching out to you to help put the move in movement. So grab a libation and join the fun. Details at hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Stanley B. Greenberg, a leading Democratic pollster, founding partner of Greenberg Research and Democracy Corps. He's also the author, most recently, of R.I.P. GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans. Stanley Greenberg, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
I am delighted to do this, particularly for America's Democrats.
Well, thank you very much, and we're delighted.
You do well.
Well, we're delighted to have you with us. Now, we, of course, are talking to you at a time when presumptive Democratic candidate Joe Biden is polling remarkably well, even in states that Trump won in 2016.
Yeah.
But after polling failed to predict Trump's victory in 2016, there is a level of cynicism about your craft. However, you recently in The Atlantic wrote, "Believe the polls this time." To begin with, the numbers are different. How does Biden's polling now differ from Hillary Clinton's 4 years ago?
Well, they're very different. First of all, I mean, in simple terms, they're at least double, maybe even triple the margin that Hillary Clinton had, in the national polls at the time. So that's in some sense, that's the smallest piece. The other piece has to do with the underrepresentation of the white working class, the forgotten Americans. Most of the pollsters assumed the exit polls were right on the percentage college-educated voters. So we really did underrepresent working class voters. And that has been corrected in almost all the polls that I know about. And that's the biggest piece. There was a white working class revolt. To be honest, there was a working class revolt, which included a white working class revolt against the Democrats, against Hillary, in some sense Obama, we'll talk in our governance, but also we had underrepresentation of our own working class voters, our own base voters of color, who had low turnout in many elections in that period. So, let me go to one other piece that's important. There's also a revolt, against Donald Trump. The reason why the polls are so strong is the American people were in revolt against everything that Trump stood for. They dislike his America First, nativist, racist, authoritarian, worldview, and they have taken every opportunity, beginning with the Women's March, to say no, this is not what we believe. And we've seen it massive turnout with women voters electing Democratic, women, and shift across the suburban, areas in particular. And that's one piece of the revolt. On America First, the country hates the trade war, and Americans want to engage with the world, not look in. And then probably most important, immigration. This is a pro-immigration country. It's become more pro-immigration. So they were in revolt against his vision way before the polls turned against him for Biden.
Well, and you wrote also in The Atlantic recently about the revulsion for Donald Trump. What tells you that this revulsion goes beyond the traditional Democratic base in a way that could hurt him in November?
Well, when you have 67% of the American people, liking Black Lives Matter, let's just start from there and then work backward. I mean, you have the country is upset about what's happened on racial injustice, on inequality, both racial and the broader inequality in the country, and they are just dead set against his vision of the country, and everything we've seen, in the way he's handled the protests, against him, what he's done with criminal justice, everything we're watching, is voters are voting against him, and there's been no fallback. There's just been a steady, increasing disagreement with the fundamental core things that Trump is battling for.
It's quite the different moment for the Republican Party, and you describe in the book R.I.P. GOP. It's a party at war with itself. How do you see that playing out today?
Yeah, it's deeper than that, and so like one of the things that I most focused on is Democrats can't be cautious. I think we're dealing with a once in a century kind of implosion of a party, of a national party, that is going to have wreckage afterwards, that we're going to be dealing with an entirely different country because of what happened. It's like when the Whigs disappeared and you had a new party system with the Republican Party dominant. I think the most important thing we're watching is the implosion of the Republican Party. That's produced by the Tea Party dominated party that Trump now leads. They took control in 2010, and they are a narrower block of the Republican Party. And they've driven out the moderates, they've driven out the college-educated voters, they've driven out the McCain conservatives, and it's a diminished party. So the party that Trump leads is a smaller party that will then have to deal with many elections to come back afterwards.
And here we are less than 3 months ahead of the election. Do you see any signs that Republicans are willing to do what would be necessary to build a unified party?
He can't do it. Look, Trump was there because he won the Tea Party base of the party. That's where he built. If you look at the primary results, in 2016, he came down the escalator. He ran as an anti-immigration candidate, attacked Mexican Americans. That was his main focus of his announcement speech. And electorally, he created a Tea Party base, which was the most anti-immigrant, most pro-gun, most anti-immigrant part of the party. Then he built a coalition with evangelicals, which he used Pence for. But we have to understand how insecure his hold on the Republican Party. None of the candidates who ran with him endorsed him at the time of his convention. None of the prior Republican presidential candidates and presidents came to his convention. He had barely half his party, and he punished people who opposed him, but he was like a 45%. And so his only strategy was to consolidate and govern for that base of evangelicals and Tea Party. But the consequences, he's driven out everybody else. He's too insecure. I mean, and if we watch him, demanding that people, liberate, Detroit, what? He has a pop gun. This is a guy, look at his rally in Tulsa. He can't get people to come to a rally. He can't get people to come, save him at the White House. It was a very insecure candidate, president, and he just does not have the ability, and he was never willing to do it. He created a government that was a Tea Party government, destroy every agency that that we work for. It just cannot, and he could not have had a worse thing happen than this pandemic, because he had to use government, but he was destroying government.
Right, yeah. We're speaking with Stanley Greenberg, leading Democratic pollster, founding partner of Greenberg Research and Democracy Corps, and also the author, most recently, of R.I.P. GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans. Stanley, turning to what Democrats need to do. Surely sitting back and just believing in polls is not enough. How can Democrats most effectively build on the anti-Trump sentiment?
Really, I was going to recommend that we just sit back and let the dice look, my biggest fear is that Democrats are too cautious, that they don't understand that this party has gone to the most extreme it can. It's survived by bringing in the most racist elements of the country. But the country will reject it in the most profound terms possible. And create a trajectory, probably something like what Democrats had to do after our defeat with Reagan in 1980 and 1984. It took us 3 or 4 elections before we had a Bill Clinton who had a different coalition and was able to then win the country's confidence. I think we're in a situation where you cannot be an anti-immigrant party. That's their main identity now. If you look at the strongest correlate with Republican, it's being anti-immigration. This is a pro-immigrant, diverse country, young, millennial, Gen Z, increasingly, all of which accept the diversity of the country. And this party is so alienated from the country. And so my fear is that we don't go all the way to Texas and battle for every Senate seat. Look what happened, when we had this, the Senate race against Cruz, when you had a competitive, Senate race, and look what happened at state, in state elections. Everything in Texas is up in 2020. Every office, and it's not that many seats to get control of one part of the legislature, and reapportionment no longer being dominated by Republicans. It's there's so much at stake with the making sure we understand this. This Trump is not happening again. That is, he's not going to win. He has less, so much less of a chance of winning now, given the trends of the country to revolt against him. And the polls reflect it, and so what they should produce I believe, is being much more aggressive in going for as big a possible electoral landslide that's there. And look at everything I see, I see Biden being pretty aggressive, both on what he's coming out for and where he's advertising and what he's thinking about.
Well, and as you well know, it's rarely enough to be against something in politics. You have to be for something. What are you hearing from voters about what they want from their next president and Congress? And is it something that Democrats can deliver?
Well, I think they can. And I think the country has seen nothing but a Tea Party dominated gridlock over the last decade, since the 2010 election. I think that was produced, by a Republican Party that was determined to stop the first Black president and his coalition from governing. And the country has not seen a party that is really dominant and has the ability to pass legislation and act on a vision for the country. And they're going to come into the election with obviously health and economic crisis and a crisis in racial justice, but with the ability to act on it. And I think we're looking at a kind of a once in a century moment where the country is looking for the Democrats to act. But it's also a country that is I think is now much more alert to the inequality that emerged in the pandemic, and the country's the racial and economic inequalities that are so vivid. But you also watch a president that they think governs for himself, for the billionaires and the richest donors, and they think they're in it for the greed and everything we're watching. If we look at what they're doing in the kind of recovery package, can you believe the Democrats have on the table, whether we're going to have $600 a week in unemployment insurance? Republicans have on the table full deductibility of business lunches. What country? What are we doing here? That they believe the reason for this unemployment is that people are laggards. That the reason they're unemployed, is because how high the unemployment benefits are. Who are these people? They're governing for the rich. They're governing for the biggest corporations. They are out for themselves, and we've already seen how much corruption there is
I have to stop you there, Stanley. You were at the tail end of that. You were dropping out a little bit on that response, and it was when you were doing the part about talking about what's in the latest bill and how the Democrats want to. Do you think you could pick up from there and then go on?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Look at the contrast on the differences between Democrats and Republicans on what's in the recovery package. What will be the next part of the package? Democrats want $600 a week of unemployment compensation. The Republicans are battling for full deductibility of business lunches, and they want to reduce it to $200. They really do believe that the reason why people are unemployed is because they get food stamps and unemployment benefits, as opposed to a crashing economy. So they're so out of touch and cruel that I think you're gonna see a Democratic Party and a country that will rally to a vision of let's make this government work for everyone, the middle class, the vulnerable, and let's push out this greed and corruption that's making this government only work for the richest corporation and the biggest donors. And I think the country's ready to rally to that.
Now, going back to 2016, one of the lessons we've heard is that Clinton did not speak to the so-called forgotten American. In other words, and you touched on this at the top of the program, the white working class voter. How do Democrats speak directly to this constituency while at the same time folding them into a vision of an inclusive America?
Okay, look, I'm glad you focused on it, because I do think it's the essence of it. And it's actually in part why I think not just why Hillary lost, but because why they had such a bad Tea Party decade, is they did not see how damaged working people were by the financial crisis, the lost wealth, lost income, and it took the whole Obama presidency to get back even to where they were before. So since the working people were kind of invisible to them, they didn't see how much they were hurt by by our own governance. They didn't get their wealth or income back under Democrats. And so, one of the biggest worries, and I'm not worried, Joe Biden is not going to say the Trump voters are deplorable. He's not going to say that. In his bones, he's battling for the middle class. That's who he's for. That's where he's campaigning, the extent to which you can campaign. But Hillary Clinton, very consciously got, hurt very much in Michigan, losing Macomb County and a lot of the white working class voters that Democrats had won back by Bill Clinton and Obama. And she decided not to campaign there, and she was not visible, winning their votes or in the rural areas. And these voters want, and rightly want, respect. But I believe Joe Biden, wakes up every morning without having to think about it and says, I respect the forgotten Americans. That's what I'll govern for. And I think they believe that.
Okay. Stanley Greenberg, leading Democratic pollster, founding partner of Greenberg Research and Democracy Corps, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. His latest book, R.I.P. GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans. Stanley, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back and talk again soon.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Trump and his allies engaged in their word, criminal conspiracy to block Congress from certifying the last election. In the realm of legal actions and legal kind of news. How big a deal is this, Barbara?
I think it's a very significant development. Obviously, this is not criminal charge. In fact, the standard in this civil case, they're trying to defeat a claim by John Eastman that his communications with Donald Trump are protected by the attorney-client privilege. And so they're arguing that the crime fraud exception applies here. And so the standard there is that there's a good faith basis to believe that a crime may have been committed to require the judge to scrutinize it. So a much lower standard than needed to charge a crime. But this, for the first time, pulls together all the various threads of evidence that have been sort of dripping out, that we've been hearing about some of the committee testimony. And to me, the most significant part of it was they've attached it to a couple of crimes: conspiracy to defraud the United States and obstruction of an official proceeding, the certification vote. They listed what we would refer to as the actus reus of the crime, which I think has always been in plain sight, the urging of Mike Pence to abuse his authority in counting the votes. But what was really significant, I thought, was this collection of the mens rea, the intent, the knowledge by Trump that there was no fraud, because that's always the most difficult thing to prove in a case.
So, first of all, one immediate result is, or one immediate consequence is that you cannot assert executive privilege if a crime is committed by the actions you're talking about, right?
Exactly. And in this case, he's asserted not only executive privilege, but attorney-client privilege, which is one that it typically can't be waived the way President Biden has been able to waive executive privilege. But you're right. If there is a crime or fraud and the privilege is being used just as a shield to cover it up, then the shield must give way.
Do you know, is this the first time that a former president has been charged with a crime?
Well, again, he hasn't been charged, but accused of a crime.
Accused, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think President Nixon was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in some of the Watergate cases. So I suppose, but by name, yes, I think so. Accused of a crime, arguing that there is a good faith belief that a crime may have been committed, and then laying out all of the evidence. I think so.
So what happens next? Is this just thrown out there? Or will there be follow-up, A, on the part of the committee, and B, on the part of the Justice Department?
Well, the immediate reaction will be from the judge in this filing, and will make a decision as to whether these documents are privileged or not, although I think he could do that without reaching this question. As for the committee, I think they're going to continue to investigate. There are many people they have not yet heard from who could provide some very important information, people in Trump's inner circle, like Mark Meadows, Ivanka Trump, and others that they'd like to hear from. I think they'll continue to push to see if they can shore up the evidence that they've amassed so far. And then I think the really interesting question is what's happening at the Justice Department. No doubt they see this. I'm one of the people who believes that they have to be investigating this. I know a lot of people think, where have they been? How can they be asleep on the job? But these cases take an enormous amount of time to put together when you are held to the standard they are, which is proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And so I'm sure they're paying attention. But to me, the thing that was so persuasive was the thing that is so elusive, the evidence of Trump's knowledge and intent that there was fraud here. And so they listed his own cybersecurity chief, Christopher Krebs, issued a statement that there was no fraud. William Barr, his own attorney general, issued a statement. All of William Barr's successors repeatedly told Trump, we've investigated all this and there is no fraud. His own campaign wrote a memo. His director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe, told him so. He lost 61 out of 62 court cases. The only one he won did not have anything to do with the outcome of the election. It was about an affidavit. And in fact, in the words of one judge who suspended the license of Rudy Giuliani, he said, there's not one scintilla of evidence that there was fraud here. So at some point, I think any jury would find that it is a reasonable conclusion to infer that Donald Trump knew there was no fraud here.
So the committee, it's a select committee a couple of months ago when Steve Bannon refused to respond to their subpoena. They asked the Justice Department to file charges against him. Could the select committee request the Justice Department to follow through and file criminal charges against the former president of the United States?
Yes, they could. And in fact, they may do that when they get to the end of their investigation, but it's not necessary. When it's contempt of Congress, The statute actually requires a referral. So for the Steve Bannon contempt, that was a requirement because it says this is how we'd like to proceed as Congress, and we need your help, Justice Department. But when it comes to a criminal investigation, it may very well be that the Justice Department allows Congress to do its work, or would be very happy to receive all of the evidence that they have amassed through their process. But it's not necessary. They could, and I think likely are, investigating right now. And I base that on the words of Merrick Garland on January 5th, when he said, as part of our January 6th investigation, we will look at anybody at any level, whether they were present or not, who attacked our democracy.
Well, I am fascinated to hear you say that, because I have been arguing with lawyer friends of mine that I believe that Merrick Garland, that there already is an investigation very quietly, very much under wraps, underway at the Justice Department. I'm excited to hear you say you share that same belief.
You're brilliant, Bill. You and me, man. We're on it.
What is it based on? Give me some more confidence.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that we can look at. One is the delay in charging Mark Meadows after a referral from Congress for contempt. One reason for delay, if they were going to decide not to charge him, they could have said so by now. It could be that it's because they have bigger plans for him, that they see him as a target of the substantive crime and don't want to see him used as a witness. There could be that. They have 18 devices belonging to Rudy Giuliani that were seized as part of their investigation into his role as an agent on behalf of Ukraine. So there's that. They have subpoenaed billing records from Sidney Powell. All of these threads pull together to suggest that that is all part of an investigation. Merrick Garland also said in that January 5th speech that we do not comment on targets of investigation. We do not say who we're investigating. We neither confirm or deny the existence of an investigation. And it's important to follow those norms even when we're in an extraordinary situation. In fact, it's even more important to follow the norms when we are in an extraordinary situation. And so I think all of those things combine to suggest to me that they get it, that they're taking it seriously, and that they're investigating. And I think it can naturally spin out of the existing January 6th investigation when he promises to investigate anyone at any level, whether present or not, who attacked our democracy. I see that as including the efforts by Trump and his inner circle to persuade Pence to refuse to certify the election results.
Is one other argument just the logic that what if they filed charges against some 400 people so far or more who were arrested for taking place in the violence at the Capitol on January 6th, that they're just not going to stop at foot soldiers, that they have to look at the people who sent the foot soldiers there?
Absolutely. And that's always the way it's done. In fact, you can compare it maybe to a hitman. It's not enough that you arrest the hitman. You want to find out the person who hired the hitman. That's the real criminal mastermind. And again, in Merrick Garland's January 5th speech, he said, I know we've started with small cases, but this is the way the Justice Department works. We work on the simple cases and we build our way up to the more complex cases. Recently, we saw a guilty plea from one of the Oath Keeper defendants who pled guilty to seditious conspiracy. He also agreed to cooperate. The Justice Department does not give cooperation credit until first meeting with someone to see if they have something of value to share. This particular Oath Keeper, his name's Joshua James, is someone who was working with Roger Stone and has been photographed with him on January 6th, providing security to him. And we know Roger Stone was one of the people going to the Willard Hotel to help, put together this strategy. And so it seems quite possible that members of this seditious conspiracy group, the Oath Keepers, if not, overt co-conspirators with this group, may have information about what was going on. And so I think that they are following this typical pattern of the Justice Department to start small and build up.
And in fact, you authored a model prosecution format, I guess, or outline for the Justice Department. And how did that come about? And are they following it?
Yeah, there's a great editor at the Just Security blog named Ryan Goodman who actually suggested, he said, what do you think about what it would look like to draft a model prosecution memo? Do you think the evidence is there? And I said, I don't know. Let me start working on it and see what we come up with and see where it goes. And once we started gathering all of the pieces, it was, to me, a pretty strong case that if it's not ready to charge now, it's at least worth opening an investigation if it hasn't been done already. This model prosecution memo replicates what happens at the Justice Department. So I was a Justice Department lawyer for almost 20 years. And whenever you have a case, other than the most routine, a very routine drug case or gun case maybe doesn't require a prosecution memo. But otherwise, prosecutors prepare prosecution memos. And it is a place where you gather all of the evidence. You argue whether it does or does not support certain statutory offenses. Perhaps you raise potential defenses that might get raised by a defendant. And then you assess, number one, whether the case can be brought. Is there sufficient evidence such that it is probable that you can obtain and sustain a conviction? And then also the question of whether you should file criminal charges. Mm-hmm. That is, does this advance some substantial federal interest? And when I looked at it in that light, I mean, I'm sure reasonable minds could disagree, but I found a pretty strong case for not only that you can charge, but that you should. There are many reasons not to charge a former president. I mean, I don't think we want to get in the business of routinely seeing administrations go after their predecessors or politicizing the Department of Justice when Merrick Garland, I think, came in for the purpose of restoring public trust and independence. But at some point, the attack that Donald Trump made on our democracy is so egregious. And there is the worry about future candidates doing the same. One of the main purposes for criminal prosecution is deterrence. And it seems to me that unless Trump and his group are held accountable, we will not adequately deter future threats to democracy.
I was struck by the fact in your recent Washington Post op-ed about this filing by the committee. You referred to it as, quote, gift wrapped for Merrick Garland, right? Like, okay, Attorney General, if you needed anything, here it is, right? Take it and run with it.
Yeah, so it's nice to see it all collected there in one spot. They pull together all the various threads, and I think if you just follow the news cycle, these come out in dribs and drabs. But to see it all in one little package, it does make a pretty compelling case. Now, a lot of people say, well, will this pressure Merrick Garland into bringing charges? I don't think he is one to succumb to pressure. I think that he has been in public life long enough to know that you are responsible for your own decisions and he will make them. But I think it's hard to ignore this collection of evidence. If he wasn't already paying close attention, I think he was. It's hard to ignore this very compelling package put together in just a few pages where you can kind of see the case staring at you in black and white. And so, as I said, and I agree with you, Bill, I'm hopeful that they're already on the job. But to the extent they weren't, it's nice to see Congress pulling together these threads for them so that they can see it in one neat, tidy package.
Well, what about the central question? We know that there's this Justice Department policy that a sitting president cannot be charged with a crime. Can a former president be charged with a crime?
Yes, I think so. In fact, Robert Mueller believed that to be the case when he argued in his prosecution memo, the report that he issued in which he declined to accuse Donald Trump of a crime. And a big part of it was this argument under the separation of powers and the role of the president, that a sitting president cannot be charged with a crime. And the reason is that it would be too distracting to his responsibilities as president to have to simultaneously defend himself in a criminal case. And it would also damage his power on the world stage to be under indictment in his own country.
Right.
But those arguments, of course, don't hold true when we are in post-presidency. And in fact, even that policy is not binding. It's policy. It's not law, but the Justice Department's own Office of Legal Policy or Legal Counsel, which writes these advisory opinions and informs policy, based its decision on that idea of how it would damage a sitting president from exercising his power. But as Robert Mueller said, once he's out of office, all of that concern goes away. And in fact, he wrote in his memo that one of the reasons he wrote his report and preserved that evidence was for future prosecutors when Donald Trump was no longer in office.
When you look at the work of the Select Committee, what I saw this morning, just checking, they've interviewed over 650 witnesses so far, issued over 90 subpoenas. They plan on sort of trying to get their interviews done and in order to hold public hearings in April and issue an interim report in June. How do you assess the work of the committee?
I think it's been incredible. They are led by two former U.S. attorneys, one who served in the Obama administration, one who served in the Bush administration, and they really have been conducting this investigation the way prosecutors conduct investigations, bringing in witnesses, using subpoenas to get records so that the witnesses can be confronted with those records. And sometimes they try to talk around things or be evasive, even though truthful. And when you confront them with a document, it's very difficult to do that, to fool a questioner. So I think it's been very effective. They've got a team of 40 lawyers, and it's been very impressive what they've done, because they've done a lot of these interviews. This is what prosecutors do. You do a lot of interviews kind of off screen, off stage, because sometimes they're the witnesses who don't really tell you anything useful or nothing new. It's duplicative of what you've already heard, or you have to take 8 hours of testimony to hear 1 hour of something interesting. And so in these 550 interviews they've done to date, I'm sure they will pull together their greatest hits and then present it to the public in a very compelling way, which is what happens at a trial. You only hear kind of the most compelling parts, the most persuasive parts. And I think by waiting until a moment, maybe in the summer, when the public has the bandwidth to pay attention to it, they can make a compelling case. And I think that's important when you're talking about charging a president. I think there will be concerns, and certainly the defense will raise arguments that this is all a political witch hunt. We've heard all this before. But
Right.
but if the facts are so compelling, and even coming from people like Pence's inner circle, which is some of what we're hearing about, or former Justice Department officials in Trump's own administration, I think that becomes much harder to see as political. And there will certainly always be those in Trump's base who are part of the group who, remember, he said famously, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue in the middle of the day and not lose any of my supporters. I think there's certainly some in that camp. But I think there are a lot of other people of good faith who would watch that and listen to it and read about it and say, wow, that's really compelling. And so I think that's what they're gearing up for by collecting all this information. I think they're doing an effective job.
What is your sense of the timing? If the Merrick Garland, if the Department of Justice already has its own investigation quietly underway, and the committee is wrapping up its work, let's say by, well, at least the interim work by June, when would a Department of Justice investigation become public and this move to the next level?
Yeah, hard to say, but it always takes way longer than you think it does. Merrick Garland even said in that January 5th speech, our work will take as long as it takes. And we set no deadline, because one thing that happens, I know that sounds sort of evasive and frustrating, but one thing that happens when you investigate these cases is, say you put in there Mike Pence's chief of staff, and he tells you some interesting things, but then he says, I was at a meeting, and you ask him who else was at the meeting, and he identifies some people. Well, now you want to talk to those people as well. Were there any documents relating to this meeting? Yeah, well, we sent some text messages and some emails, and somebody took minutes. Well, now you want to get that. And so then you talk to those people, and they tell you some things you didn't know. And so it's hard to know when you're done, because there's always kind of one more rabbit hole to go down. But at some point you realize you've exhausted it. You've talked to everybody about all the key meetings. You've talked to all the people who are at the key meetings, and you feel like you have a very good sense of what was happened at the key events. And it may be that, you've got a dozen episodes that you've investigated, and really only 4 of them matter to the outcome of the case. And so you ditch all that work that you did in those other 8 episodes, and you focus on these 4. But so you have to do a lot of work that ends up not really mattering in the long run, but you have to do it to make sure there's not some plausible defense that you weren't aware of.
Mm-hmm. And you point out, and again in your Washington Post op-ed, that for Merrick Garland, it's a lot more complicated, right, than it is for the committee, and that there's one additional test that he has to prove before he moves.
Yeah, not only does he have to decide whether a crime was committed, and again, the standard's so much higher, beyond a reasonable doubt. So you would want to put all these key witnesses in the grand jury and really push their memories to make sure they're not just kind of spitballing, that they, when they testify that Donald Trump said X, their recollection is clear, or they have documents to support it. It can't just be, musings and other kinds of things, real evidence. But the other question, as you point out, is not only can a crime be charged, but whether it is in the best interest of the country to file charges. You may remember that Gerald Ford famously said, when pardoning Richard Nixon, our long national nightmare was over, he believed it was in the best interest of the country to move on, that we not spend all of this time and energy focusing on something that happened in the past. But I think in this case, Merrick Garland will have to make a hard decision about all the negative consequences of charging a former president, the politicization and the outcry and the loss of public confidence that it may cause. and the precedent it would set. But I sometimes now think back that what if Richard Nixon had been held accountable? Would that have prevented a future Donald Trump from doing what he had done? And so I shudder to think what might come down the road in the future if we don't hold Donald Trump accountable now.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.